passenger trains should be subsidized. Recommendations have come from the Association of American Railroads that this should be the case. Recommendations have come from the Interstate Commerce Commission. The National Association of Railroad Passengers was doing its part to lobby. Finally now, congressmen were beginning to see that this issue could start affecting them and that it could spread to other places. So from that cancellation, within a couple of weeks, an Indiana senator named Vance Hartke introduced a bill in the Senate to subsidize passenger trains operated by freight railroads at about 80% of the loss for what the government might deem essential passenger train routes. The last minute, it was actually substituted by the plan for what became Amtrak. This was a plan that had originally been developed by the Federal Railroad Administration earlier and was refined as this legislation, now to create a national railroad passenger corporation that would assume the responsibility for running passenger trains on a core route of networks across the United States. Basically, the freight railroads who had been running passenger trains were offered the opportunity to buy into the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, and that was the way that they would alleviate themselves of their responsibility to run passenger trains. And if they bought into Amtrak, they could no longer, in fact, run their own passenger trains. The buy-in into Amtrak was basically a combination of cash that they could pay or equipment that they could donate up to an amount, and that amount was an apportioned amount of the losses that they had incurred on their passenger service in 1969. So railroads gave cash, railroads gave equipment. That amounted to about $200 million that Amtrak was able to begin with, in addition to $40 million that came from the federal government as a grant and a $100 million loan. This was the capital that Amtrak would begin with. The name Amtrak was actually one of the last things to actually get resolved. The National Railroad Passenger Corporation bill had been known as RailPax, and many people thought that that would be the name of the company. And then in 1971, about a month or so before the actual beginning of Amtrak, this name was recommended by an advertising firm. It was short for American Travel by Track.
Literally overnight on May 1st, 1971, half the passenger trains in the United States just vanished. 26 railroads were invited to be in Amtrak, 20 of them accepted. Amtrak ran what was basically a skeleton system of the passenger trains in existence at that time. Of the railroads that stayed out of Amtrak, the most significant were the Southern, the Denver and Rio Grande Western. Amtrak's initial cars were donated, more than anything else, by the railroads that operated passenger trains on May 1st, 1971. Most of the cars were in very poor repair. So some of the Amtrak, early travels on Amtrak were complete horror stories. Bathrooms not functioning, air conditioning marginally working. But Amtrak set out and bought some brand new cars almost immediately. They bought the Amfleet cars for Northeast Corridor, and they invested in Superliner cars for the long distance trains. All major improvements over what they had inherited from the railroads.
A lot of people think that the only troubled railroads in the United States during the 70s and the 80s were the older railroads in the East, where all the factories closed down. You know, the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central, which merged in 1968 to become the Penn Central. You know, the little regional carriers like the Lehigh Valley and the Long Island and the Jersey Central, they all went bankrupt. And out here in the Midwest, we had the weaker regional railroads like the Rock Island and the Milwaukee Road. They went bankrupt, were essentially liquidated. Their useful track was sold off to other railroads or to commuter agencies.
Amtrak was created by the U.S. government as a life-saving device to ensure that rail passenger operations continued, because in the late 60s the railroads were pensioning for abandonment of many of the passenger rail lines due to the fact that they could not make a profit in their operation. So Amtrak was formed to ensure at least a skeletal passenger train operation for the United States. It seems that in recent years, though, that Amtrak, instead of being an operation to sustain passenger operations, is in fact, if you look at what Congress is trying to do in terms of underfunding, is trying to actually kill the passenger train, just as the private railroad carriers did in the 1950s and 1960s.
Amtrak faced its biggest challenges probably about 8 years after its creation. The Carter administration cut 6 major intercity passenger trains over Labor Day weekend in 1979. Then a couple of years later, President Reagan's budget director, David Stockman, made Amtrak the whipping boy of balancing the budget. And there was a real effort by the Reagan administration, early on especially, to cut Amtrak completely. Those efforts failed, and Amtrak has pretty much chugged along on its own, pretty much under the radar for the most part, until just recently when the Bush administration has once again gone after Amtrak.
My daddy's dad was an engineer, rolling them rails both far and near. Told me tales about all he'd seen from the East Coast down to Abilene. You can hear that Wilson blow. You can hear that Wilson blow. Wake up in the morning and hear that sound. It's the train coming into town. Hear them wheels go clickety-clack. Means that train is coming back. You can hear that whistle blow. You can hear that whistle blow.
This has not been an easy task to come up with a reform package. And I think it's a good plan that we've put forward, and I look forward to working with you to turn this into reality.
We put together a Department of Transportation back in the 60s, and one of the things the Department of Transportation was supposed to come up with was a national transportation policy. We're still waiting. They've never, ever sat down and decided and put into law or anywhere else what our national transportation policy should be. So we pretend that we remain in a free market economy on how people are going to choose to travel. But in fact, with the free interstates and the subsidy of the commercial aviation system, the fact is the government chooses how we're going to keep the books.
I think we're being very short-sighted in our policy. I think transportation is critical to our economic future, whether it's looking at it from a national scope or just the regional scope. The importance of moving traffic, moving freight, moving people through our communities is so vital. And right now, whether you're stuck on Interstate 95, you're stuck at the airport waiting to get on your plane, your freight is stuck on a freight transportation railroad line somewhere out in the middle of the country, we're not moving America.